This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello.
What's up, Jason?
Nothing. I'm going out tonight. How about that?
Yeah?
There was this actor in the early 90s I was a huge fan of. He's doing stand-up in Memphis randomly. So my sister, her husband, Shannon, and I were all double vaccinated. So we're like, let's go. Let's do it. So
That's awesome. Who's the actor?
Chris Kattan. He's in Night at the Roxbury.
Oh, okay.
Movie.
Yeah.
It's him and Will Ferrell. And then
that'll be fun.
It almost sounds like Nitch, right? Like I have I don't have my camera on. Behind me, like I have the like Funko Pops, and one of them is his. And so like I was like, oh my God, he's coming to Memphis.
Sounds like a good way to use your vaccine.
How about y'all? What's up?
I thought I was going to get finally the bid for my house today, but of course that's been delayed till hopefully tomorrow now. But I'm excited for that. But I'm not excited for the construction loan and all the payments and nonsense. But
did you turn in your 50 years of paperwork?
Not yet. We don't do that until we get the bid finally. Okay. So probably Monday or whatever. But yeah, I got to go through and collect the last bank statements for whatever and tax returns and nonsense. And then, of course, that takes 30 to 45 days. So maybe in a month and a half, we'll break ground. But it just is delay after delay.
You're like a modern version of the Titanic gif where she's like, it's been 84 years.
I feel like I'm like Rails 7 now.
Well, was it Rails 6.1 that took forever to come out? Rails 6.2?
Yeah.
So, Chris, I did want to mention WNB.rb, which is a new virtual community for women and non-binary Rubyists. So they're looking to support a more diverse group of people making contributions to Ruby. And they do have a monthly event. It has 2 Ruby talks. And by the time this airs, we'll have just missed their latest event. But it does sound like a really good way for people to get involved in the Ruby community.
It sounds awesome. Very inclusive and very supportive. That's just like what the Ruby community is known for, like people being amazing. And this is another fantastic thing. So their Twitter account is WNB_RB, and you can check them out there and find their events. And it looks like the one you will have just missed on April 27th has a talk about Rails application templates and rewriting your scaffold templates, which I am very familiar with. And sounds like a wonderful thing to talk about because not enough people know about that. And Ruby Motion and Dragon Ruby, which is really relevant to us talking about building iOS apps. So sounds like some really good content there.
I think it's really cool. I think shout out to the organizers of that. I think it's really cool trying to get more women and non-binary folks involved in Ruby. So yeah, check it out.
Today we have Joe Masilotti on the show. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Super excited to be here, guys. My name is Joe. I am a Turbo developer, which sounds crazy because I feel like I'm like the only one in the world. I do native iOS. I've been doing Turbo when it was Turbolinks, primarily an iOS developer, Rails developer, got started at Pivotal Labs a number of years ago. I did the whole 9-to-5 pair programming thing, learned how to TDD, learned how to write really good software, learned how to empathize with customers, and spun off and working for myself now for the past year or so and help big Rails monolith websites bring their mobile website to mobile native with what used to be Turbolinks and is now Turbo. So been doing that for a couple of clients, for myself as well, for my own website. But yeah, it's been a blast seeing Hotwire evolve over the past couple of, I guess, January it was released officially. Hasn't been a while.
Yeah, or January or December. I can't remember now. I like the term turbo developer. It's a pretty good one. It's funny because the Hotwire naming is just it doesn't mean anything. It's the collection of stuff. So I feel like whenever I'm writing about it or whatever, I'm like Hotwire and Turbo because people are searching for one or the other. But yeah, it's kind of strange. But I'd love to hear because the excitement around Turbolinks back in the day was look at this. You can build mobile apps and whatever with it. And then there quickly became several warts with it that were like, yeah, it doesn't really handle form errors and all that. How was that in the early days when you were starting and just using the Turbolinks version?
Yeah, when I got started, God, it was a long time ago. Turbolinks was technically still in beta. We got like an early access, which was really cool. And we're building out the iPhone app at the time. And Turbolinks didn't really do much besides make the XHR request, shove all the content into your body, and do a diff on the head. Like that was kind of the whole quote framework at the time. And the iOS adapter was a small wraparound that said, hey, you click the link. And that was kind of it. And it only worked for GET requests. So if you had any sort of forms or anything, your iOS app would just no op. Like a post request would just no op. Nothing would happen. You get no error message. You wouldn't get a console error. Nothing at all would happen. So a lot of the work with Turbolinks and iOS was making sure that all your forms were XHR and AJAX. And back then, Rails didn't really have like a recommended approach besides just .js responses. That was their approach for everything with remote forms and remote true before local false or whatever the new version is. So it was kind of like you were on your own. You had to do all of your form migration by yourself. And that was always the biggest problem. It was like, this iOS app is ready to go, but the forms don't work because there's all this Rails scaffolding that needs to come into place. And Turbo, no links, so just Turbo has just completely elevated that to another level where you just slap on Turbo, you get rid of your Rails, JavaScript, custom stuff, and form submission with TurboStream will just kind of work for you. And the iOS app works really well with that because it receives the redirect request. So I've been really happy about that. It's made my life a lot easier to pitch these type of projects to clients because it's like you have way less work to do. It's more on the iOS developer and not on the Rails team. But every client is different. Every client has the whole app is behind a login wall. Only these screens are behind a login wall. And that's where the real native stuff kind of comes into play. And yeah, I'm looking forward to see just like where Turbo evolves in the future. I really wish they kept the name Turbolinks though. It's just like so hard to Google. It's going to be so hard to Google for turbo errors when you mean like Turbolinks without putting Hotwire in front of it. But that's my small qualm with the framework.
I have that problem with stimulus right now because of the US stimulus. I'm like, stimulus something. It's like Joe Biden. I was like, no, that's not what I want right now. Stimulus.js
is usually what I search for. And then it just ends up searching that website. And I'm like, oh, God.
Right. Yeah, or searching for like cucumber and getting a bunch of nonsense. Yeah, there's a lot of that has been solved kind of much more nicely now with the better error handling and responses and stuff. Because I remember at some point I opened an issue on Turbolinks and was like, hey, like what's the plan to support errors in scaffolds? Because like out of the box, scaffolds don't really work with Turbolinks in doing remote is true on your forms and having them be AJAX requests. And there were several solutions that got posted on there. And one of them was like extracted into the Turbolinks render gem, which was like what I used in Jumpstart Pro for a long time, just to make the forms submit with AJAX so they would work on mobile apps, at least in theory. Like I didn't ever really try it, but at least then the errors would go and update the page and re-render it and stuff. But that's now like thankfully nicely solved along with a bunch of other little improvements. The frames, I'm sure, are a really useful improvement on mobile. So you can go like change out a portion of the page quickly and you don't have to send over the entire payload. Because I think that's probably a bit more critical when you're building a mobile app. The performance there, you don't want to have to send over all of the HTML, kind of do that as little as possible. So what are some of the things that you've built in the past that are like good examples of things that people need to think about, like when they're going to go convert their app to mobile? I know immediately like navigation is usually totally different. It's one thing to just like have a responsive nav bar on your mobile website, but like you want tabs on iOS probably, so it feels native. But what are those things that people should be thinking about when they're trying to convert their app?
The old answer was always remote forms, like get those working before you talk to me so we can make it smooth. And that's kind of been like, okay, now just make sure you're on Rails 6.2 or, you know, what the version that has the latest turbo enhancement, the turbo Rails gem in it. And that's been really nice. So that's kind of a given. You touched on it a little bit there. The menu bar is just kind of a hassle on this like hybrid world. A lot of developers or teams will want to reuse their web menu or their web nav bar, which like totally makes sense. You put a lot of work into that. It depends on who's signed in, what privileges they have. So there's a lot of logic that you don't want to duplicate somewhere. Sadly, the Basecamp approach is to do that all natively. So you look at something like the Basecamp app or the Hey app, and all of those menu bars are like when you click the top left or right of the screen, all that's rendered there is usually native code. And that's not trivial to copy over all the logic from your server to implement an iOS or an Android. So that should change with Strata. I'm not holding out yet because it hasn't been released. So what it ends up meaning is that you want to render your web nav bar. And as Chris can talk about, we've been doing that a little bit together. That ends up being some sort of like JavaScript hook where you're like, okay, here's your nav bar and you use your normal application template. And then here's your mobile nav bar and it has some things stripped out of it. Maybe it doesn't have the sign up link or it has only the special sign in link or register. And what helps a lot there is to use request variants. Request variants were introduced, I think Rails 5 or a while ago in Rails, and they turn your like .html into a .html plus native or .html plus kiosk or something. And you essentially get these like array of variables that you can then render different templates for based on different parameters, like the user agent or the width of the screen or something. And that lets you render out just like totally different views based on different screens. And that's been really helpful. Most of my clients will end up using something like that to render out how they want to show the menu on their native devices. And then a little stimulus controller or something that will show and hide that menu to make it feel native, but calling it through a native code base. And that's kind of where the bridge comes in with the iOS app. So you'll put like a native button on the screen or something that will call JavaScript that will open up and close the menu. So like the client isn't actually doing anything. It's just telling the web view, hey, perform this JavaScript. And then you get to leave all the logic on your server, which is really nice.
Yeah, the bridge stuff is like where the magic really comes together, I think, because you can execute JavaScript from your native iOS code, which is cool. So like the menu button that we've got in the Jumpstart iOS template is like you tap the native button and then it says, hey, WebView, go run this JavaScript, which triggers an event. And then your regular old stimulus controller is like, hey, I saw that. I'm going to go open the menu. That is slick. It is pretty cool. And then, like you were saying with the request variants, we just have a different nav bar that's invisible with just the hidden menu because you end up using like the iOS native header nav bar thing. You don't generally want that in the web view because it won't feel as native. Yeah, that's been like an interesting thing to see that like I wouldn't have expected that the iOS code could just tell it to execute JavaScript in the web view. It feels like it's almost like building a browser extension in a way where you can just interact with the web page. Have you used that in any fascinating ways for other apps that you've built?
Yeah, the JavaScript Bridge is usually what I will highlight it or call it. One of my clients has this almost on every index page, they have a more CRUD functionality, which has a plus button. And the plus button will be something like add a new one of these entries or edit button to edit that entry. And it's always been in the top right in that menu bar on the web, but you don't really have that. Like you were just saying, you hide that menu bar on native. So what we do is on every one of these pages, we have a stimulus controller that fires the other way around, fires a JavaScript to the client with a payload that says upper right, this image name and this path. And the client reads that payload effectively and says, oh, cool. I would need to add a native button to my screen in the upper right with this image. And when someone clicks it, route to this URL. And it creates this like, it's kind of like the bridge going back and forth. The client is telling the server or the HTML, show and hide your menu. The server is telling the client, hey, show this button. And then when that button is clicked, you just route the URL like you would any old URL as if someone tapped an old web view. And it just kind of like works magically, which has been really cool. And one of the things that like makes that actually kind of blew my mind when we discovered it was if you use SF symbols, which is a library of assets that you can use for free in all of your iPhone apps. You can just give the name of the symbol over the wire and then dynamically populate that on your iPhone. So you don't need to package hundreds of icons in your iPhone app. You can just reference this little string and then render effectively SVG, but like a glyph as your icon, which becomes a really powerful design asset in that you can change the look and feel of your buttons or your screens or A/B test them or whatever you want to do, all from the server, even though it's affecting native code, which kind of like every time I talk about that, I'm like, we're living in the future. This is amazing. I've always wanted to be able to change native code through the server without Apple yelling at you. And this is the way to do it. It's amazing.
So I don't know. I've been doing Rails for 9 years now. I know about none of this. And I feel like everyone should know about this. Like, have you just done a massive amount of like research into all this, like getting into source code? Like, how did you kind of learn about the bridge and all this stuff?
So when I got started with Turbolinks, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago. Like I said, it was like the beta still. At the time, I was just consulting for this company. I ended up working for them full time for a number of years. But the CTO founder was like, we're doing hybrid. And I was like, no, we're not. Hybrid is terrible. And he eventually convinced me to try Turbolinks. And it's like, Basecamp is doing it. They're really great guys and gals. Like, they're a great team. They know what they're talking about. Like, I was like, all right, fine, we'll go give it a shot. And we struggled with it for months and months. And finally, we had something. It went from 0 to 60 overnight, where we had a broken iPhone app that didn't do anything to a feature complete mobile app that did everything the Rails app did because we fixed the final bug. Like, that was just this huge light bulb moment where it was like, once you get to that point where you have the skeleton of the Turbolinks app or Turbo app working, you get all of your Rails functionality for free and you get new features for free. That's the magic of hybrid. And to answer your question more directly though, like how I learned, a ton of trial and error, a ton of communicating with the Basecamp folks, either on GitHub or on Twitter. I've worked with a number of clients. Like I said, they all have very particular needs. And a lot of it was just like, we need to do this thing. And then it's up to me to figure out how either Basecamp is doing it or how, if they're not doing it, how we can do it in a way that is scalable, like that native action button that I just talked about. Luckily, Basecamp has effectively open sourced their JavaScript. You can go to Hey App and inspect their JavaScript package. And Chris and I do that every now and then when we need to figure something out. And it's super effective in seeing like, oh, this actually isn't even a web button. They're just sending a payload over the wire and then the iPhone app has to handle it. So learning that and like learning from other people has been super helpful. I blog a ton on my website about turbo development. I'm in the middle of writing like a huge 6-part series of how to get started if you're a Rails developer doing iOS. But yeah, it's been a lot of that, like a lot of trial and error, a lot of different companies, and just trying to be like very open about it and getting feedback from people all the time has been a huge help.
I think it's super cool you're blogging about it. This is the thing I've been interested for a long time. I've tried React Native, I've tried Ionic, I've tried just pure Cordova. And every time I end up with something that it's not what I want as an end result. I'm sure some of that's my own lack of skill, but everything you're talking about is the dream. The new features for free, like pretty much free. Yeah, that rules.
Don't let Spencer hear. You're going to have to go build the Podia mobile app here.
Go. Well, we don't use Turbolinks or Turbo right now, so it might be a little difficult.
That'll be at least a year-long project, I would guess. That's the interesting thing too, is Joe, you were saying like being able to change the icons from the server side. There's something about that makes it really nice that you don't have to like go shift gears when you want to go build a new feature. You can build it all in the web and then slowly make it feel more native. You don't have to go and build things twice, I think is like the big value there. It is interesting that there are some pieces that you have to like duplicate, authentication or whatever, if you want it to feel more native. But it seems like there's a ton of value in that.
Now, you touched on progressive enhancement. On the web, that's okay. You build an HTML site that does normal HTML post and whatever requests. Then you add a layer of JavaScript on it. And then maybe you go full fat client down the road. And it just progressively enhances itself based on the user's JavaScript and what they can do. And that same like practice, not for the same reason, but the same practice applies for Turbo apps where you have a screen that like, I always use the example of you have a screen that on the top is a Google map and on the bottom is a list. And when you scroll the list, the map changes, right? Pretty standard finding things or locating things on a map. You put that on an iOS client in a hybrid app, and it's going to feel really bad because you're going to see a Google map that looks like the web view, has the web view controls, has the weird 2-finger scroll issue in your iPhone app. And you're like, well, it works, but it's not great. And then that's a perfect opportunity for you to say, okay, when this path is hit, don't render the web view. Render my totally custom, fancy Swift UI, native library SDK view that I've been spending weeks developing with my team. And you don't have to do that at the beginning. You're free to do that at any time when it makes sense for your product or your business. And that's where I think Turbo excels even more in that it works with really small teams that have a huge surface area, and it works with bigger teams and larger teams like Basecamp because they can enhance these new screens to make them look great when they matter and not at the beginning. You don't have to create every single screen native to launch an app. You only have to create a couple, the sign-in screen or the sign-out or 1 or 2 important ones.
I think there's like so much value in that because all of a sudden I don't need to go learn all the concepts of building stuff in Swift or Android or whatever. There's a whole lot of conceptual differences and just it's a very different language than Ruby. And all those little warts, it was much harder when it was Objective-C, but thankfully we have Swift and that's easier now. But even then, it is quite a context shift and it's nice to be able to have, and Basecamp is a good example. Like they only have a couple mobile developers, 4 or 5 or something, split across iOS and Android. And I think I never really hear this talked about, but like the Basecamp desktop app, I think is an Electron app. I believe, or something like that. Like and it maybe is actually an Apple native app or something. Because now you can get this.
It's Electron because I use it every day, and when I hit Command R, it refreshes the page like it's.
Yeah. It's running the same conceptual thing as the other devices, which is like wonderful. So then you can kind of ship 3 versions and do minimal work on each one, which is going to require 3 separate teams if you had to build all those from scratch natively. So that's pretty awesome. Joe, would you talk about, there's this concept of the path configuration, and that is specifically like a Turbo native concept. These routes do these things and you have rules and whatever. Can you touch on that and kind of explain what that does?
The path configuration is where a lot of the Turbo magic happens, I think. It is a JSON file that you throw on, you bundle with your iPhone app, and it has a couple keys in it that are important, but the most relevant one is just something called rules. And rules allows you to route regexes into dictionaries, like at its whole. And what that means is that you can say, like when someone clicks a link, it goes through the path configuration. If it matches one of your regexes, it spits out those properties. So if you, for example, set it up to route anything that ends in /new or /edit to add a modal property, when someone clicks the new link, when you are in charge of routing your URL in the iPhone app, you see if it has that modal property. If so, you do something different. And this is really helpful because it lets you change how an app is configured and how it looks, kind of how it feels based on this just one configuration file. So I was talking earlier about how you have a screen that's half map, half list. You would add to your path configuration, like maybe like /items, :D for the ID, /map, route it to a native controller. And that gives you a lot of flexibility because you can add those after the fact. You can add them when you bundle the app. And what's really cool in Turbo that wasn't in Turbolinks is that you can make this remote. So when the app launches, you can have it load the local file and then fetch a file on your server that will overwrite your local file. So that enables you to do crazy things like remotely configure your iPhone app how it handles certain URLs. Oh, you realize there's a bug in that map screen we just talked about? Don't route to it anymore. Just route back to the web view until you fix it. You could also do crazy things like A/B testing, because there's going to be cookies associated with that, and say that certain users receive this screen, certain users receive that screen, and it's all handled in your path configuration, which is probably abusing it a little bit, but it is definitely fun. One of the cool things about the path configuration is that those other keys as well have just like arbitrary values in them. And that's a way to pass down effectively just arbitrary remote configuration from your server to your client. So in Jumpstart on this is really cool, the iPhone iOS client, we are doing something really cool where you can configure your tab bar from the server. So you set a property on your path configuration in your JSON file on the server that has the key tabs, and it lists an array of all your tabs, the icon it should show, and the path that it should load. The iOS app loads that configuration, and then for every tab that it reads, sets a new tab in your native tab bar, pointing to that URL, which allows you to completely restructure the home screen of your app, the launch screen of your app, all without ever touching iPhone code once you've set it up initially. And that's kind of like just this awesome goal that we've had with Jumpstart, is just like, how hands-off can the iPhone code, the Swift code be? And how much can we push to the Rails app for both configuration and just like design and all that good stuff? But I got distracted because it's exciting. Path configuration is pretty cool because, like you said, you can do the modals, you can do the native controllers. You can also just do, like I said, like the arbitrary settings type thing. So if you wanted to like white label an app, you could pass down your accent color and then have iOS set the color of all your screens, like the little blue outline that you see on your icons. That could be green or blue or orange, depending on the day of the week if you wanted to. And it can all be done through this remote path configuration, which is something that normally would be handled through like Firebase, which is just like a whole hassle to set up and like a whole Google SDK to integrate. And now it's kind of just sits as a JSON file on your Rails server, and you can do whatever you want to it, which is pretty cool.
Chris, you know what really just bugs me?
It seems like it's on the tip of my tongue.
Bugs.
Oh, dang it. I knew it.
All bugs.
Of course.
Real bugs, bugs in my app, Bugs Bunny, anything with a bug in it bugs me.
I can see why.
So I'm asking Chris for your professional opinion as a thought leader in the industry. How should I handle these bugs?
You know, I learned in school that honey badgers are really good with bug problems.
You mean a literal honey badger?
Or maybe honeybadger.io.
But if I sign up for Honey Badger, what do I get?
Well, something that is really useful that actually just saved my butt the other day was their uptime monitoring. I was doing an update on one of my apps and made a deploy and didn't notice right away that it went down. So that was a really good, useful feature there. Not to mention that they've got your error monitoring for those bugs. Yeah. You should go check out Honey Badger, it sounds like.
Sounds like it. See you, Chris.
It's so awesome that you could just say like, hey, let's add a new tab today and publish that on the server and never touch the app. And next time you boot the app, it will have that tab, which is cool. Because yeah, that's one of those things that I didn't think about when I was building most apps. I'm going to want, at least on iOS, the tab bar at the bottom and look to Twitter or Basecamp or Hey or all these other apps and try and think about how would I want my app to look like on mobile. And yeah, you're going to want the tab bar, but then you have to decide like, what are the key things you want down there? Like those are the critical things. You maybe have a home or a, dashboard thing, but then you have, if it was Go Rails, the latest episodes or the series or whatever. And it becomes a whole different design in a way, but you can control that remotely, which is like really handy. I think the question a lot of people will have is, what about authentication? Like, do I have to do OAuth and all that? That seems like the daunting thing of, yeah, we can just drop in the web view, but all this native stuff now needs to know some context of whether or not I'm logged in and whatever. What are your thoughts? I saw that issue on Turbo iOS about the sign out that we can talk about too. But yeah, let's dig into authentication.
Yeah, sure. Super relevant, right? Like 4 hours ago, I published like 1,400 words on native authentication with Turbo on iOS. So that was like as much as I could trim it down as possible. So like that gives you the context of how much code and stuff goes into native auth. There's a good start. So the first question is always like, why do we have to do authentication natively? Why can't we just use the web view? And I challenge you and your team to say, if you only ever need to authenticate with the web view, don't do native auth. Just do normal web view auth. You can use your existing sign-in screen and registration screen. And as soon as that person signs into the app on your Turbo client, they'll have the cookie set. They'll be signed in until the cookie expires. So you make sure that you never expire it and you're good to go. The question comes down to if you ever need to make a web request authenticated as a user outside of a web view. So the classic example is I need to send my push notification to the server so I can receive push notifications to the client. And that would normally require like an HTTP request, URL session, all that good stuff. But you have no way to authenticate because you can't use those same cookies because of the whole CSRF thing. It's going to be a post request and you don't want to disable all the good stuff that happens with Rails. You need essentially a token or an API key or an auth, something to attach to that URL request to let the server know who you are and validate who you are. So the way that we've been doing it on the Jumpstart app, the way that I like to do it with my other clients is you do it all natively. You do a Swift UI view with a sign-in screen, username, password, a button. It makes a post request. The server then has an endpoint, like an auth endpoint or something along the API, validates your user credentials. We like to use devise. So the devise is a really nice, like valid password question mark or something like that. Works really well. It's secure. It stops timing attacks, which is really nice versus just doing a lookup. And the important thing is that you then will set your cookies. So you essentially sign in that user, which is weird because you're making an HTTP API request JSON, but you're setting cookies on the response. Bizarre. But why you need to do that is that when the client receives that response, it gets two different things. It gets the JSON body, which has that token or that OAuth token or the JWT, what have you. It uses that to make those future HTTP requests. But then it takes all those cookies. It takes that session cookie and writes them directly to the web view. That then enables you to be signed in on the web view or any other web view you use in a Turbo context without having to go through another sign-in flow on the web. And this is bizarre. It's not how authentication works. It's not how iOS recommends anything, but it's how hybrid has to work. It's like you need to be logged in two different places, so you need two different ways to authenticate. And this cookie, getting the cookies in the response works really well. All the way at the end of that article that I published today, which I'm sure we'll link to in the show notes, will have a link to that. But it's essentially just like you take the response, there's a function or a method that's like get cookies effectively, and you write those to the web view storage and you're good to go. You reload the page and you're good to go. And that works great because now you have the user signed in on the web view. You have your auth token or your access token where you can sign in or authenticate for HTTP requests. And you are back in that, sweet spot of both worlds where you can make those authenticated native screens that are really use the latest SDKs, or you can just use your Rails normal views for all the other stuff. And that user is going to keep the context and everything with not the same session, but you'll be able to use like a current user helper and it will be the same person at least. Whew.
Yeah. And I was going to say too, like you can configure the path configuration to say, hey, if we get a unauthorized response, we can go trigger that native login screen. And that's just kind of another feature of that. Is that right? Like, is that something built in or something that you have to add yourself?
The catching of the 401, using air quotes, is like when the Turbo framework on the client receives any sort of non-200 response, it gets sent to like an error handler. You can just check that response code there. And if it's a 401, kick off your authentication flow. On the server, you do need to do a little bit of reworking to make that work though, because Normally, you don't get a 401 in Rails. You just get redirected right to the sign-in screen. And that sign-in screen is going to be a 302 with then a 200. And that would not become an error on the Turbo iOS app or Turbo Android app. It would just think you were redirected. So what we do is in Devise, you can set up a Turbo failure app, which is something I didn't know about until recently, that essentially says when someone is unauthenticated, run this block of code. And they have a little method called HTTP auth, which will just do a status code based on the response. So you'll get a 401, no problem. It's like 6 lines of code. You set that up in your Devise config and you're good to go, which is pretty sweet.
Yeah, I didn't know about that either until Hotwire came out and then Devise was broken. And it was like, okay, down the rabbit hole and learning about failure apps and Warden and Devise. And so that there's quite a few weeds, but sometime soon, I think you'll still need the custom failure app, but the responders gem will be updated for Hotwire at least. So I don't know if it'll work for the mobile stuff exactly like this, but at least it will work on the web of rendering. Actually, it might work properly because it'll render the unprocessable entity error. So that might not, you maybe don't need to override that in the future. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's one really handy thing I wanted to mention was the Turbo native app helper that Turbo Rails adds. So on the server side, it will check the user agent, which is going to include Turbo native or check to see if Turbo native is mentioned in there. So then you can tell when the user might be on the Safari or Chrome on their phone, but they're also in a web view on their phone when they're inside your Turbo native app. So that adds or modifies the user agent so that you can tell the difference between those two, which is what we were using for the failure app to determine the two different handlings for that.
So I was a little curious. This is kind of unrelated, but kind of related. Have you had any troubles with the App Store in terms of like approval processes using something like this? Because it almost sounds sneaky, right? Like we're pushing out updates without having to go through Apple's approval process, but like they know this is happening. I'm just curious your experience.
And DHH is starting fights with them.
I personally haven't had any rejections because they thought we were building a web-based or remotely configured app. That's not to say I'm going to guarantee that everyone who builds one will have that same luck. Some things that I can say that will give you better odds of not being rejected by Apple are making sure that you're not straight up just packaging your website into a client and calling it a mobile app. If they did their research, there's a chance that could be rejected. You do want to add at least one feature that is native only. I always say push notifications. It's the main reason you have apps on your phone. It's what everyone wants as a product, as someone who makes products or runs a business. Push is key for mobile apps. If you added push notifications, you already are way better than a website in terms of the App Store's view, and they'll be way more likely to accept that and not reject it. But then when you look at something like the whole debacle with Hey and the App Store, not related at all to hybrid. Like hybrid was not mentioned in that conversation once, or at least it wasn't relevant if it was. So the fact that Apple was that close to the Hey app and never really cared that it was hybrid, it was all about the money, for lack of a better word. I think that just shows that like Apple is way more open to these types of apps than it was, or than they were in the past. And they care that you're making an app that works great, doesn't have bugs, and has not been done before. And as long as you can make that argument, I think you'll be okay. But don't quote me on that because you never know with Apple.
Sure. Yeah. My only App Store experience was a rejection because it had to do with cigars. And they're like, nope. And I was like, all right, well, this has been fun. Not going to develop apps anymore.
One question that came to mind on that topic is if you do payments, are you going to have to use like Stripes Mobile SDK instead of the web version, or do you have to go through the App Store payments and stuff?
Yeah, so Apple has very strict rules on how you can purchase goods via a native app. And this is something that is like, it's hairy, but it's very clear cut as what the rules are. In general, essentially, if you're buying physical goods or a service, and this is very in general, so it's with a grain of salt, you don't need to use in-app purchases. If, however, you're buying any sort of digital good, subscription, or consumable digital good, you do need to go through the in-app purchase flow and have Apple take their cut. So this is something that when you do develop your Turbo native app, you will have to think about really seriously and read through the guidelines on that of, am I okay to use the existing purchase flow, whether that's Stripe or Braintree or PayPal or what have you, or do I have to convert this to native in-app purchases? And I'd say that if you're not sure, they have as an Apple developer, if you have a registered account, you get 2 questions per year that you can just ask and someone will actually respond to you like directly. I would say ask them, because it's better to be upfront with them and to be honest with them so they can guide you down that path versus being like trying to sneak it in behind them. And then all of a sudden you get rejected and you have like huge bug fix and you have to rebuild your binary because you have payments or whatever, and you're screwed. So read the guidelines, talk to Apple, create an open communication. But again, they're very cut and dry and very clear on what is and what is not allowed. So you should be able to make a decision on your own.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I was just thinking about like, it'd be cool to have a Go Rails mobile app, but maybe that's just something where like you already have to have an account and you can't sign up and subscribe from the phone. You have to do it on the web or something. Like Netflix, Hulu, and all those are ones that you can probably copy. If you wonder, you can go look at them and see like how they do it and all that. You build your app and you get it working. How do you go test it on your phone and then submit it to the App Store and all that? Because I think I've done that maybe once before, but like never gone through the whole process. Like I don't think I have anything that I've actually made on the App Store. I'd love to hear that.
This used to be a huge pain, and Apple has done a really good job in the recent years of kind of bringing all the beta testing in-house into something called TestFlight, which you've probably seen floating around. It's essentially just a way to distribute beta code or beta software to a select group of people. And there's limits on how many people you can use, and you can't take money through it. They do a good job of managing all that. But my normal flow is to use Fastlane as a Ruby, technically a Ruby gem actually, that automates the packaging, signing, and uploading of your iPhone app and Android app to Apple or Google servers for you. And you create like a 10-line, essentially build script, but it's all using their helpers that will download your provisioning profiles, sign the app, make sure it's built with the correct permissions, upload it to the App Store, and then mark that as testable, which is super nice because that is like, used to be every iOS developer's nightmare trying to get something uploaded to TestFlight or whatever third-party service, hockey app you were using at the time. So that works really well. It's like not that exciting anymore because it's kind of figured out, which is like, feels really cool, but also kind of makes me realize how long I've been in the industry. That's not a problem anymore. I use that for all my clients. I use that for all my apps. I pretty much copy the same 10-line config over from project to project. You'll probably see the same one in Jumpstart eventually to get a good feel for it. But yeah, you upload it through TestFlight. You then can invite external users there through their email address. You can run a beta up to like 1,000 people. It's a pretty generous number. And they will then get an update on their phone, a push notification when you upload every new build, which makes it really fun to do continuous improvement. It kind of enables it for iPhone for native apps because you can pretty much update once every like hour at most. So huge teams won't be able to do continuous integration, but a single developer, a 5-developer team won't be releasing more than once an hour. You'll probably be totally fine. And if not, you can just have a build script kick off like a nightly or something. Either way, it's way better than it used to be, and builds take about 15 minutes to process at most, and then you get a notification, you download it, test out the new feature, write your bug report, which you can do all through TestFlight now as well, which is sweet.
Sounds pretty smooth. Is there like the equivalent of sort of your environments for iOS like you have in Rails? When our app's in development, we want to hit localhost 5,000 or 3,000, and then in TestFlight, we want to hit maybe the staging site, and then in production hit the actual production URL. Is there the equivalent of something like that?
Out of the box, there's no direct support for this, but there are ways to implement it on your own, and the listeners who are going to see the Jumpstart package will eventually see this there as well. But the short of it is that when you run the app through Xcode, so that's usually local dev, you can set an environment variable that only gets passed when you run it via Xcode. So that's usually how I say this is in, point to the local server. Then you can have a little if statement that says, does this particular sandbox receipt exist? Which means, are you running on TestFlight? It's like a receipt validation is how iOS does in-app purchases, essentially to say that it's not fraudulent. There's a receipt somewhere, and TestFlight builds automatically have this like special receipt is pretty much all I can say. That's all I know about it. You check for that receipt. If it's there, you point to staging. If neither of those two conditions exists, you point to production. That's been my like flow for probably a decade and it's worked. Some clients will need something where they need to like point to a different staging server or review server on Heroku. So we'll build out a little, I'm just doing this for a client I'm working with now. They have like a little secret button in the upper right that you tap 10 times and it pops up a dialog that's like, which server do you want to hit? And then it resets the whole app and points to the new server, signs you out, which is really fun, especially if you have like a QA team that needs to point to different stuff. But for a pretty standard app, like that if-else statement of local TestFlight production will get you like 80% of the way there for like 15 minutes of effort.
Sounds easy enough. Yeah. Yeah. I felt like that was one of the things when I first looked into it. I was like, how do I change these variables based on where it runs? Because all the examples were like, boom, drop your URL in here, like hard code it. And I was like, that is a little strange coming from Rails because everything's environment variables or credentials or whatever. And so that's good to know. Yeah. Is there any other aspects of the mobile stuff that you can think of that we haven't talked about yet?
One thing that we haven't touched on at all is Android. And that's probably on purpose because I don't do much Android development. But a lot of the same approaches that I'm talking about will apply for your Android, your Turbo Android app. The adapter was updated when Hotwire was released. My guess is that's why it was delayed so much because they weren't ready to release the Android adapter, but that's a different conversation. The Android adapter was pretty broken for like almost a year and a half where you actually like couldn't use it for Turbolinks. So it's awesome that it is ready and you can use it in production for Android. It follows the same practices. You set up your server once and it works with both apps in general, which is really nice. Yeah, it's just like you have to build out that same scaffolding for Android as you did for iOS. But that's always going to be 2, 5, maybe 10% of what your actual full app would be if you built the whole thing natively. So you get a big win there, of course, just by going hybrid. I know a couple Android devs who do Turbo like part-time. If anyone knows any like full-time ones, connect to me because I'd love to meet them and exchange notes there.
Yeah, you mobile Turbo native developers are a rare breed. There's hardly anyone using this stuff, it seems like. Some friends of mine used, I think, the Turbolinks iOS stuff, and they built a mobile app out of it. And I don't know, they built that and sold the company, but like there are people doing this stuff in secret, I think, but they're just getting whatever they need done and not, needs to be more people talking about it like you're doing. The tutorials are like everything I wanted back in the day when I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And then no one ever talked about it and explained some of those, basically all the issues that you see on the repo are like, how do I do authentication? And like all these common things. And those weren't really well documented. So you're doing an awesome job, like going through and filling in all those gaps in the documentation, which is, I think, going to be a huge thing to make this more accessible to people. Because yeah, I want to go build a mobile app for Go Rails and I would like to learn just enough to go do it, but I don't want to like do it all native. That is way, way more effort than is worth. So I think this is super exciting stuff. So can't wait till the Jumpstart Pro iOS template is functional and stuff. Still got a little bit to go on there, but it's like every day, like it is so much fun to play with. So I'm excited. Can't wait.
This was super fun. We talk Ruby so much and we're still talking Ruby, but we're also talking mobile apps. So like, I know it's just a nice paradigm shift. It was nice. So thanks for taking time out of your day to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was awesome. I love talking Turbo, especially with folks on the Rails side. Usually it's the folks on the iOS side that I chat with. If anyone has...
I was going to ask, you have to convince them that the hybrid approach is worth doing in this style? Because I'm sure they see a lot of, we can do it better native, fully native, or React Native or something. This is still quite different than a React Native.
Yeah, the people that are easier to convince are the Rails developers that want an iPhone app for sure, which like is the target audience. if you can already do iOS, you're not going to build a Rails app to then build your iOS app. So I understand like where that line is drawn, and to be able to reach all those Rails developers that are just like, if only I had a really basic functioning iPhone app or Android app, this unlocks that in just a fraction of the effort, the work, the money, everything.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps it up. Where can people find you and your blog posts and your Twitter or whatever?
Yeah, Twitter, I'm at Joe Masilotti. Website is masilotti.com. And my email is joe@masilotti.com. So as long as you can spell my last name, you can reach me somewhere. I'm sure all that will be linked in the show notes. By the time this is published, the whole series on Turbo might be done. If not, there'll only be one more episode left, which is on app structure and architecture. But everything else up until then is covered, including like the URL routing, the basic setup, why you want to use Turbo, how to convince your boss to use Turbo, all those cool things. So if you take a look and have questions or whatever, just send me an email, reach out on Twitter. I'm always happy to help.
Awesome. Well, yeah, sounds good. Think that wraps it up. Jason, any last words? Any famous last words?
God, I hope they're not my last words. No, just once again, thanks for joining us. And so, yeah, we'll see y'all next week.